Welcome to today's Brown Bag session on fostering metacognitive skills in teaching and learning. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Beth Marcellus, the Instructional Design Team Lead for the Education and Technology Innovation Support Office, or ETI. Joining me today is Dr. Linda McCauley, who's an instructional designer for the ETI. So here are the goals for today's session. Please take a moment to review them. I'll be quiet to give you all a chance to read. Now, as you can tell from reading the goals, our plan for today is to cover the theory of metacognition first, and then we're going to go into some specific examples that will support your teaching. Before we begin, please take a moment to think about the following questions. What do you know about metacognition already? And what do you hope to get out of today's session? So first off, let's talk about what metacognition is. In essence, the basic way that people talk about it is metacognition is the ability to think about one's own thinking. So purposefulness, self-consciousness, and self-awareness are some of the kinds of things that can distinguish metacognition from just standard cognition. The ability to refocus your attention or realizing an action needs to take place. There's many things you can do as you're going through your day that could be considered metacognition. It's also specifically what we'll be talking about today is the application of metacognition in education, referring specifically to the strategies and techniques that we as learners use to help us learn most effectively. So just a brief digression into the history of metacognition for folks who like to know where things come from. The idea can be traced back to the questioning style of Socrates, who said famously, "The unexamined life is not worth living." But what comes from this is this idea that when we're thinking or we're doing something, we can also think about what we're doing or thinking. So this idea of consciousness and being able to think about what you're doing. Then you can trace it through to educational philosopher John Dewey, who believed that we actually learn more from thinking about our experiences than from the actual experiences themselves. As we think about it and go through life today, a lot of people are really thinking more about experiences, right? It's not just doing something, but thinking about it after the fact really helps you to realize and appreciate what you've gone through. And metacognition is part of that process. Then when we move to actually the educational realm, John Flavel was the person who first documented a theory of metacognition and started to theorize about how it worked. So if you're looking at the literature of metacognition, Flavel is the real name you're looking for in initiating the theory in the late 70s and in the 80s. The early research on metacognition started to look at, and Flavel's work was really looking at young children and how they learn and trying to think about how they can learn and how they could improve the ways that they learn. Research has also looked at how experts display metacognitive thinking. We've got a lot of folks in the room who are probably experts in a number of fields, and you'll know from your own experience that you may think about things differently than people who are less experienced. And that's part of the metacognition, this idea that you're thinking about how you're thinking and you know how to do it well. That's part of what can distinguish an expert. And also research looked at the effectiveness of a metacognitive approach to instruction. And that's what we're going to try to look at today is what would that metacognitive approach to instruction look like? So in order to help you start thinking about how to foster metacognition in your students, we're going to talk a little bit now about the processes that underlie metacognition. So according to Flavel's model, as we're learning, we can also monitor what is happening. And this monitoring occurs through the actions of interactions among metacognitive knowledge, metacognitive experiences, goals or tasks, and actions or strategies. So these are the concepts that are in play as you think about metacognition. Metacognitive knowledge is probably the most complicated of these concepts. But it really is the learner's knowledge or beliefs about what factors or variables act or interact during the learning process. And for Flavel, it can be broken down into three categories. There's the person. So that's things you as a learner believe or know about yourself. There's the task. There's things you know about the task at hand. So what are you supposed to be doing? What information do you have to complete the task? And what do you know about the task itself? Then also there's a strategy element. So what's the best way to complete the task? So this element of metacognitive knowledge is built on your past experience in part, but, and this is important, it can be supplemented by information provided as part of the task or other retrieval cues. And when you hear that, you can realize that that's really a part where as an instructor, you can play a big role in helping students develop metacognitive knowledge. So those three variables, person, task, and strategy, as an example, you can think about, I know that I, which would be the person variable, have difficulty with word problems, which would be the task variable. So I will answer this computational problem first and save a word problem for last. That's a strategy variable. So that would be a person sort of thinking through how they're going to approach a problem. So metacognitive knowledge is an important element of metacognition. Metacognitive experiences, this next item, has to do with where you are in a learning environment and learning situation and what kind of progress you're making or likely to make. So you're going to have more elements of metacognitive experience when you have situations that stimulate a lot of careful, highly conscious thinking. But it really is the process of going through the learning process is metacognitive experience. Goals, tasks, again, in the bigger picture, that's as we work through metacognition, that's just a task you're trying to complete. Then the action strategy, that's a way that you're trying to complete it. So as you think about metacognition, there's a lot of things that we as experts in subject matter may be doing unconsciously. But as you work with learners who have less knowledge or experience, you'll want to think about how the process works. So let's break down that process a little bit. One of the important things to realize is that there's really three phases of the metacognitive process. There's a planning phase, what you're doing before you go into a learning experience to help you succeed in that learning experience. Monitoring the learning experience. So again, as an expert, we may be thinking a lot about what we're doing and self-correcting. Our learners who aren't as experienced may not be doing that. So we want to really help them focus on what they're doing during the learning process, this monitoring to help them improve. And then the final phase is regulating or evaluating learning. So once we get to the end of a learning experience, how did it go? And again, as you emphasize for your learners this three phases, it's really important to really focus on that so that they know that they can affect their metacognition and their learning at each of those phases. They can plan, they can think about what they're going to do to be successful. They can monitor to see if what they're doing is working and adjust if needed. And then afterwards, they can regulate and think about how it went and what they might want to do differently next time. So you may recall at the beginning of the session, we asked you to think about what you know about metacognition and what you would like to learn. As you may now recognize, or may have recognized then, for those of you who know more about the topic, we really wanted to start you thinking about learning process so you could prepare to monitor what was going on within the session. Say, oh yeah, that's what I thought it was. No, I didn't. Oh yeah, this is going where I thought it was going to go, or no, it's not. Just asking those kinds of questions to think about the process are very important. So again, just to reiterate, to be successful using metacognitive techniques, students must do the following: develop a plan before approaching a learning task, monitor their understanding and use fix-up strategies when that meaning breaks down, and evaluate their thinking after completing the task. Now, in a little bit, Linda will talk a little more about ways that you can help your learners to build their metacognitive skills so that they can do these things on their own. But I want to talk a little bit more about metacognition before we jump into that. So just to wrap up this segment, we want to think about how to foster metacognitive skills in your students. And why would you want to do this? Well, as you hopefully are starting to think about as you think about the topic, it can improve students' learning outcomes. The more research has shown that the more students think about the process, they can improve their outcomes as they try to think about what they're doing and how they're doing it and how they can do it more successfully. It can enhance their problem-solving abilities. Again, as you think about it, the sort of trial and error, as you keep track of what you're doing, the more you think about how you're doing what you're doing, the better you're going to be at doing it. Obviously, by the process of emphasizing the thinking process, you're going to increase students' self-awareness and self-regulation, and those can both be very effective ways to help students learn on their own. And again, we're trying to develop in skills the ability in students, the ability both to succeed in the work that they're doing with us in the classroom, but more importantly, as they go out of the classroom and they start trying to become lifelong learners, it's really important for them to develop these skills and self-regulation. And the more we can help them as teachers to try to develop these skills, the better they'll be both in our class and in the future. So metacognition can help predict student learning performance. People who have developed more effective strategies are going to perform better. And it's important to keep in mind that it can support both online and face-to-face teaching modalities. So as Linda talks about techniques to use, we'll be talking both about techniques you can use in the classroom and also techniques for metacognition that you can use outside of the classroom. Studies have shown that metacognitive strategies do have a positive correlation with online learning performance, and they're necessary for academic success. So students who lack metacognitive strategies are not as easily able to see the bigger picture of the task at hand. And so they're not as successful as those students who have been able to develop these strategies. So for students, conscious knowledge is really key to metacognition. It's important that students know about the strategies so that they can begin to apply them. If you just sort of lead them along and don't tell them what they're doing, they're not going to be able to do it on their own, separate from you. So you really want to make sure they know what they're doing, what specifically you're helping them to develop skills to monitor their own learning. And the more they know about that, the more effectively they'll be able to monitor their skills. And the more practice you give them, the more it'll become natural to them. Again, as we think about it as experts, we tend to use strategies unconsciously, right? We're just going to keep doing things because that's the way we've learned to do them, and we know that they work for us. But thinking back before we became experts, we really had to think maybe more about what we were doing. And that's what we're thinking about with learners and metacognition, to really emphasize to them what they're doing and why they're doing it. And this knowledge precedes practice. So the more you tell them what they're doing, the more skills and strategies you give them, and then give them opportunities to practice, they can start building the knowledge and building some success. So they realize, oh, this strategy really worked for me. This strategy didn't work for me. And they really are able to build that in and use those kinds of strategies as they're learning throughout their all learning experiences, not just the task at hand, but any time that you're giving them tasks or any of their other instructors are giving them tasks. Another important element of metacognition and learning for students is you have to allow for error making. So I'm sure Linda will be talking more about this later, but really it is important to have these sort of low stakes environments where it's okay for students to make mistakes. And as you give them different techniques and strategies and help them learn how to learn and think about how they're learning, they can learn as much from errors as they can from successes. So really think about giving them things to do and things to try, and giving them a lot of options so that they can think about it, make mistakes in a safe environment, and then move on. And again, you want to give them these opportunities to practice, but let them know what you're doing. Like, hey, here's a couple of techniques you might want to try, and then think about, reflect after the fact, which of those strategies worked for you. And then as you move on through the course, you can remind them to get back to some of those strategies that worked and maybe discard some of the ones that didn't work for them. So again, one of the really nice and important things about metacognition, as I said before, is that it really is something that you can, as an instructor and faculty member, help your students develop to help themselves build their own skills. And so if you're fostering a growth mindset through metacognition, you really want to promote the belief that these abilities can be developed through effort and practice, and make sure they realize that. So keep letting them know what strategies they're using and thinking about practicing using those strategies so that it becomes second nature to them. Another important element of making sure metacognition works for them is teaching them resilience and perseverance, right? So that if you're teaching them things, you want them to realize that they can work through any problems they have. And that's something as a conscious process. They don't just try something and stop when it doesn't work, but really have them think about not just that it didn't work, but think about why it didn't work. And then that will help them develop this resilience and perseverance. And again, figuring out how to keep trying to think about what they're thinking and continue as tasks get more complex. So you want to encourage your students to embrace challenges, not, as we said, stop when the going gets rough, but work through them, but think about what the challenge is and what the problem is, and what are some ways they could address that challenge. So as they're thinking about the process, they can embrace challenges rather than succumbing to them. And again, as we said before, you want them to view mistakes not as problems, but opportunities for learning, to grow from those mistakes. Another important element of metacognition is helping students to think about how they can transfer knowledge and how they can use these strategies in other arenas. So as you're trying one problem-solving strategy that's going to work in one place, it may also work in other places. So help them start to think about, as they're in the early days of trying this, their early learning experiences, really think about, oh, this worked here. Do you think it would work here? Do you think it wouldn't work? And so that's part of developing and emphasizing these strategies and letting them see where things can work and be transferred from one area of skills and practice to another.
So now that we've shared this background on metacognition and why it is so important, let's begin to look at those specific ways that we can incorporate metacognition explicitly into our teaching and the learning process. As we look at these different strategies to put it into practice, we will also mention some technology tools that you can use for each of the strategies. But before we dive in, let's take a moment to practice some metacognition and take a minute to reflect on what we have covered so far and think about what resonates with you the most. So our first strategy is to demonstrate metacognitive thinking through Think Alouds. It is important to do this. It is one of the easiest ways to promote metacognition, just by modeling it in practice with your students. So share your own reflections, strategies, problem-solving processes, the thoughts that you have that go through your head, and explicitly teach effective questioning for metacognitive thinking. By doing this, you have to remind yourself and remember that you, as an expert already in a topic or a task, may notice things that your students, who are probably novices, will not. So just by explicitly modeling a Think Aloud, modeling this process, it will help your students learn and move them along the continuum from a novice to an expert. Some of the technology options we have for Think Alouds would include video. So as you're working through a problem or going through a process, you could record yourself doing it, and then also talking about what you're thinking about, what you notice, what you see, what your steps are that you would go through. If you don't like putting yourself on video, you could do the same thing also, just with an audio recording that the students could listen to. And then you also might consider using some mind mapping tools, like a web type brainstorming idea, to get the ideas down and show the students the process you go through. You think of an example probably from your earlier education of like the writing process, where you might have brainstormed some ideas on a mind map or a brainstorm cloud list, so that you could then get your ideas down before you wrote your paragraphs, that kind of thing. The next idea is to incorporate regular reflection activities into the learning process. By doing this, by making it a regular and recurring activity, students will get more comfortable with it. One way to do that is through knowledge checks. And with knowledge checks, you could allow students to self-assess their understanding and then notice that making those mistakes is really just a low stakes, no pressure, so that they can become better learners and understand more in that safe learning environment. You could also use a think, pair, share strategy, and this allows students to learn from each other and to incorporate others' perspectives and understandings into their own knowledge. So with think, pair, share, first the student thinks to themselves what they know, then they pair up with somebody sitting close to them in the class, or if you're using a virtual online environment in, say, a breakout room, where they talk in that one-on-one with just one person, and then you come together as a whole group or whole class and you share some of the key takeaways as a whole class. So it allows students in a safe, smaller environment to learn, but then still you get back together as a whole group to share those learnings. And sometimes this strategy is most effective because students are more able to explain concepts in words their peers will understand than sometimes we as an expert in our field will use. And so just doing that activity will allow the students more time to provide their own explanations of how they look at a problem or how they look at a solution, and then their partners can help them work through where they might be confused. And this promotes more self-awareness during their own learning because they are actively involved. As you think about ways to incorporate that reflection into the learning process, you can use technology. So you can do those knowledge checks using the quiz tool in the learning management system. You could use Google Forms, where students could respond that way. You might even do this in discussion boards, where you could do a think, pair, share with discussions, or even other ways of reflecting for the larger group in discussion boards. And then you might also want to use Poll Everywhere. We do have a license for Poll Everywhere, where you can use that as kind of a clicker question type of style, where you could poll the class at particular points during a lecture, for example, and get the feedback immediately on how well they're understanding the concepts that you're trying to teach, and then adjust your teaching from that point forward based on those responses. Our next strategy is to ask students to identify their strengths and areas for improvement. So in this way, it helps our students take ownership of their learning. And then it also provides you as the instructor with a lens for how to teach in the future. If you encourage students to set goals and monitor their progress, they will be more engaged in the learning process and likely more successful because they are paying attention to how they're doing and what they understand. You do want to create time for this, and specifically create time for learners to plan how they're going to prepare for exams. Think about asking them to prepare. How are they going to study? And then later, how did it work? And how might they improve next time? You can do that formally if you'd like. We have here on the slide that you might want to ask students to keep learning journals, where you ask questions of them that they might respond to on a weekly basis to help students reflect on the how of their learning rather than just the what. You might include questions like you see here on the slide, or you could ask other questions like, what was easiest for me to learn this week and why? Or what was most challenging for me to learn and why? Ask them again about their study strategies. what worked well for them and why, or what might they try next time to do better. Think about their study habits in general, not just for tests, but how are they preparing for class? What works for them best, and what are they doing? How does it work for them? What are they doing, and why is it working? And then what might they try to improve upon for maybe the next week? And by writing it down, simply writing it down adds to the engagement and adds to that reflective piece, so they actually do think about their learning and think about how they're thinking about what they're learning about. Some of the ways that you can do that, again, are using the quiz tool in your learning management system. You could add questions about metacognition to the end of your exam so that the students actually do the process. You could use Google Docs for them to write. If you wanted to do those learning journals electronically, you could do that. You could also use simulations or other interactive content where you actually could put places within the simulation or the interactive content where there are pause for reflection, or pause to write down what you've learned in the last section. Even videos. If you're doing videos, you can ask students to pause for a moment and reflect, so that they are still engaged and still paying attention to the processes that they're going through. By encouraging them to express themselves, like with these journals, for example, they will start to figure out what works best for them. And sometimes we assume that by the time we get students at our level, that they already know how they learn best and they already are expert students. But don't assume that. Give them those opportunities to continue to grow and develop what is best for them as a learner so that they can be the most successful. Our next strategy is to provide those prompts or guiding questions, because as we talked about earlier, we can't assume that students know how to do this. We can talk about it, we can model it, but sometimes we just have to give them the actual prompt or the guiding question to get them to actually engage in metacognition, because then that provides the support and the guidance that they need to be more successful. So it's not as anxiety inducing to do it, because you've given them the parameters under which to do it by giving them that guidance and support. By giving them that framework, they might actually want to do it or engage in it more naturally. One way that you can do that is to consider your exams and think about adding some higher order thinking questions like an essay to your exams, rather than just using multiple choice. Yes, we know that multiple choice questions are easier to grade, but we also know that studies show that students use different study techniques, different learning strategies when they know the test is just multiple choice, and they engage more deeply in those higher order and higher level metacognitive skills when they know there's going to be those open-ended higher order essay type questions on the test. So just by adding a few essay questions to your exams may improve the way students are reflecting on their learning and digging a little bit deeper into actually understanding the concepts as they prepare to take that test. Obviously, the technology options then again are still quizzes in the LMS, using Google Docs, maybe discussion boards, or even videos with those embedded knowledge checks where you can have the students respond. Because in Panopto, for example, you can embed questions that students actually have to answer before the video will continue. So you can do that to make sure you provide the prompt and make sure that they actually answer it. And then our last piece is to make sure that you close the loop through feedback. So we model this, we provide opportunities for metacognition, but make sure that you offer constructive feedback to your students on the metacognitive processes that you've asked them to engage in, where they used effective metacognitive skills, where they could improve. And that way you will help your students notice the entire process, and you will encourage your students to actually engage and reflect on that feedback and make the adjustments that they may need to make to be more successful. Nothing is more frustrating than providing tons of feedback to a student on an assignment that they've completed, and then to find out that they just looked at the grade and then they tossed it in the trash. And they didn't really reflect on the feedback we give them. So make sure that the feedback you provide will help them not only to understand how they got the grade they did, but also how they can be a more effective learner. And to do that, you can use this feed grader comments tool in Canvas, and that can become a dialogue between you and the student, because you can write a comment and they can respond. And then that way they continue the learning process. You could also use Google Docs or Word if you like to provide feedback that way. And if you're interested, you can also consider video or audio feedback to students, so that they can hear you and see you as you provide that meaningful feedback to make that closer connection with the students. Take a moment to think about what you will now add into your teaching arsenal to support your students and promote metacognition, and to think about what tools you have available to be able to do that.
Thank you for watching today's Teaching with Technology Brown Bag session. You can view all Teaching with Technology Brown Bags on the USU YouTube channel under the full ETI playlist. Have a nice day.